If you were a kid between 1979 and today, or at least after 1979, then you had the best childhood ever because there was only one network that was fit for kids, and that network was, and forever will be the one and only Nickelodeon. 35 years have passed, and now it's not just a network, it's a phenomenon. So how did Nickelodeon change from the number one kids network to number one in the ratings to just Public Enemy number one and blaming our society? Well, in honor of Nick's 35th anniversary, we'll give you a little history of the network for newcomers, experts, and those hardcore fans. Back in the late 70s, there were no kids networks. The only networks there were ABC, CBS, and NBC. Then in 1977, a cable system known as QUBE, owned by Warner Communications, now Time Warner, was launched in Columbus, Ohio. And one of the networks was called Pinwheel, which was the closest thing to a television network for children. Then on April 1st, 1979, Pinwheel was relaunched and renamed as Nickelodeon, and the rest is history. Pinwheel was one of the very first shows shown on there, of course, but it also had some other shows like Nickel Flicks. Incidentally, this is how it got the name Nickelodeon, which was the name for an early movie theater back in the early 20th century. Back when it first started, Nick didn't do so well because of its poor ratings, but it did have an ace up their sleeve, a show that would revolutionize the network. That show was their first real hit, and it was known as You Can't Do That on Television. The show was like a version of Saturday Night Live, or seeing how it was made from Canada, SCTV, aimed at a younger audience. The show was iconic for being among the first among many variety shows, the launch of future recording artist Alanis Morissette, and of course the green slide that Nick would later be famous for in their other shows. But YCDTO-TV was only the beginning. There were other shows, including Live Wire, Standby Lights, Camera Action, Mr. Wizard's World, and one of their first animated shows to be seen on that network, Danger Mouse. Nick started to climb up the ratings in 1984, and some major changes began taking place. Nickelodeon was now owned by MTV Networks, which is a division of Viacom. Geraldine Laybourne became president of the network, but the biggest change of all was that the silver ball logo was changed to the iconic orange splat logo that we've all known and loved for 25 years. Fred Siebert and Alan Goodman, who designed the famous MTV logo, designed this revolutionary logo and a couple of new station IDs and jingles for the network. The help of their animators and the doo-wop group, the Jive Five, who gave us the famous Nick 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 jingle that Nick kept since its debut in the mid-80s. Because of these changes and more, Nickelodeon was riding high. The next big thing that Nick was turning out was game shows just for kids. And the one that started it all was the one and only Double Dare. It started the formula for Nick's game shows, such as kids being contestants, getting messy, winning prizes that kids would want, answering questions about pop culture and stuff kids would be experts at, and of course having time slots that kids would be able to watch as opposed to regular game shows like Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune. The host of Double Dare, Food Network personality and neat freak Mark Summers, would be the last person you would expect to host such a sloppy game show. Considering that he was obsessive compulsive, and yet he enjoyed hosting the show like he was in heaven. And the crazy physical challenges and the even crazier and messier obstacle course also made the show so unique. By the late 80s, Nick's ratings were reaching an all-time high, so it became number one in the ratings game, even beating out three major networks combined. In 1988, Nickelodeon started the tradition that would continue to this day, an award show that only the network's viewers would vote and would want to watch, known as the Kids' Choice Awards. It had categories that other award shows didn't have, like favorite cartoon, favorite video game, well as the things you would expect from an award show like favorite movie, favorite TV show, favorite actor/actress, favorite athlete, favorite song, and so forth. It also incorporated the use of slime, much like YCDTO-TV and Double Dare. We would always look forward to it because it was the only award show that made the Oscars look overblown. Back when Nickelodeon didn't use much original programming or original animation, they usually passed the time with so many syndicated cartoons as well as Warner Brothers Looney Tunes to pass the time. But Nick still was pushing out more and more shows such as Hey Dude, Wild and Crazy Kids, Don't Just Sit There, Out of Control, and Total Panic. And that was just when it celebrated its 10th anniversary in 1989, and when the 80s ended, it was the beginning of things to come. It's no secret that a majority of Nick's best shows came out during its strongest decade, the 1990s. And it was a decade that Nickelodeon became a household name and a big name in entertainment. The first thing that happened was they finally built a studio where Nickelodeon programming could be shot. Nickelodeon Studios opened its doors to the public on June 7, 1990 at Universal Studios, Florida. A lot of game shows, sitcoms, specials, and other stuff out there, and a majority of them is what we will discuss here. 1991 was truly when Nick started to get its mojo working because it began making so many new shows, hits such as What Would You Do?, Nick Arcade, Welcome Freshman, Salute Your Shorts, and 15. Clarissa Explains It All was another show that was a hit. Starring Melissa Joan Hart as Sabrina, Clarissa follows the exploits of teenager Clarissa Darling and her life. So many characters, funny jokes, hip fashion, and a catchy theme song, Clarissa was one of Nick's greatest shows. But the biggest event on Nick in 1991 was the birth of their original cartoons, or as they dubbed them, Nicktoons. These were the first cartoons to be created by cartoonists, have original premises, and are on cable TV rather than network TV. The very first Nicktoon, Doug, centered around Doug Funny and his life in Bluffington. Although it does seem weak when described like that, Doug showed us just what somebody like Doug's age really is. Doug was also the start of the regular kids in school genre of cartoons. It honestly works so well that people wonder why it's not being used today. Granted, there are some flaws, but still, Doug was a great show. It was only the first of the three new cartoons that premiered in Nick in 1991. The second newest show was Rugrats, created by Arlene Clarke and Gabor Chupo, who did the animation for the first three seasons of The Simpsons. Rugrats usually centered on the lives of infants Tommy, Chucky, Bill, and Lou and Angelica, and the world that surrounds them. Much like Doug, Rugrats did a fantastic job of showing the world through the eyes of their viewers, and won 3 Emmy Awards and numerous Kids' Choice Awards. Third of the three new Nicktoons was probably most controversial, Ren and Stimpy. Unlike Doug and Rugrats that usually showed kids' eye view of the world, Ren and Stimpy was purely crazy, and that's what made it so fun to watch. With crazy animation to the traditional cat and dog team seen in most cartoons before its time, and tons of sexual innuendos, Ren and Stimpy was a great show that could be enjoyed by both kids and adults for a long time. For more information on these and other Nicktoons, read the book Not Just Cartoons, Nicktoons, available at bookstores and online everywhere. In 1992, Nickelodeon was still making history by burying a time capsule at Nickelodeon Studios in Orlando, Florida on April 30th, not to be opened for 50 years. But it wasn't the only thing that happened that year. Nickelodeon teamed up with Michael Malley of Get the Picture to host a game show that was similar to American Gladiators, but was still its own thing. Nickelodeon Guts. It was where kids would live out their sports fantasies and go for the gold. Guts was one of the very first extreme sports shows for kids, as well as the first extreme sports show in history. Nick's biggest event in 1992 was the creation of their own Saturday night lineup known as Snick. Snick took some of Nick's biggest hits and along with some new shows on a 2-hour lineup every Saturday night from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Its original lineup started with Clarissa, then their first new show, Roundhouse, an improv comedy show that poked fun at the media like in Living Color while pulling together a storyline throughout the whole 30 minutes. The result was one of the most underrated sketch comedy shows ever. You should absolutely check it out. Next came Ren and Stimpy, followed by another new series called Are You Afraid of the Dark? While it isn't as scary as it was back then, it was an anthology series about a group of kids known as the Midnight Society who would usually tell scary stories every week around a campfire. Although it was a little bit cliche, it was pretty creative. Snick was one reason you wanted to stay home every Saturday night. In 1993, Nickelodeon was starting to go overseas and was available in the UK for the first time. Nickelodeon also started its own magazine called Nickelodeon Magazine. It was similar to Disney Adventures in that both of them were made for grade school kids, and it talked about the media stuff that usually wasn't owned by their company. 1993 also gave us new shows such as Legends of the Hidden Temple, another game show in which you run around the Mayan temple find hidden artifacts. The Adventures of Pete and Pete was another good show because it was the first real live-action show that had a narrative. Kind of like a younger version of Seinfeld, which at the time was a pretty popular show. With Mike Verona as older Pete and soon-to-be Nickelodeon regular Danny Temporelli as younger Pete, had a lot of memorable moments. Another hit show that year was Nick's fourth Nicktoon, Rocko's Modern Life. It's centered around a wallaby named Rocko and his everyday misadventures of living on his own. Much like Ren and Stimpy, Rocko had some crazy animations and sexual innuendos, but it also had some more things that made it unique, such as its animation by Joe Murray, writing by future SpongeBob creator Steven Hillenburg. By the way, SpongeBob himself, Tom Kenny, does a few voices on Rocko, such as Rocko's best friend, Heifer Wolf, and some great characters and scenarios. By 1994, Nickelodeon became king of the ratings and had its 15th anniversary. One of its presents to the network was an educational community known as the Big Help, in which kids help out in their community to make the world a better place, because the world was pretty bad in the 90s. Every year there would be a telethon in which kids would help in their community. The Secret World of Alex Max was a show that was a big hit. The series was about a teenager named Alex Max, played by Larissa Orlanek, who accidentally gets doused with some toxic chemicals and has strange powers. Made it so good was the special effects and the memorable characters. Nickelodeon also made another Nicktoon in 1994 called Ah Real Monsters. Made again by Klasky Chupo, the show centered around three monsters who go to an academy to learn to scare the hell out of humans. In short, it was kind of like Monsters University, but it was unique enough to make main leads, Icus Criminal Blina, likable characters. In 1995 was when Nickelodeon entered the internet with its own website known as Nick.com, back when the internet was used through America Online. That year also gave way for another famous character, Stick Stickly. Stick was a popsicle stick with googly eyes and the host for Nickelodeon's 2-hour block known as Nick in the Afternoon. Stick was what made the block so special, and he is still very popular today with his fans. 1995's biggest hit on Nick was one of their best sketch comedy shows ever, All That. It was the first show to be created by Mike Tollin and Brian Robbins and Dan Schneider, who made a lot more shows on Nick even to this day. It was sort of like SNL in a living color. It greenlit the careers of Amanda Bynes, Josh Herbert, Danny Burrell, Cannon, and of course Kenan Thompson and Kel Mitchell. The sketches and characters such as Airboy, Good Burger, Vital Information, Ask Ashley, and more were all permanent parts of our childhoods. Add a theme song by hip-hop group TLC, and you've got a show that is in fact all that and a bag of chips. 1996 was when Nickelodeon was starting to get into the film business with Paramount Pictures, since they're both owned by Viacom, their first feature film, Harriet the Spy, starring Michelle Trachtenberg. The movie was a big box office and critical hit. Nickelodeon also made some new shows at the time, such as one of their best live-action shows ever, Kenan and Kel. It stars Kenan Thompson and Kel Mitchell from All That, centered on the misadventures of Kenan Rockmore Thompson and Kel Kimball Mitchell, and the zaniness of their teenage lives. Tolan Robbins, who also gave us All That, along with Sister co-creator Kim Bass, created the show, and Dan Schneider wrote some of the scripts. He said that the two stars had great chemistry on All That, and the logical thing was to give Kenan and Kel their own show. Kenan and Kel is a cult classic that will go down in history as one of Nickelodeon's best shows. Plus, it had a great theme song by rap artist Coolio. Nickelodeon also gave us not one, but two brand new Nicktoons. Hey Arnold was created by Craig Bartlett. The show was about a boy named Arnold who has a pretty cool bedroom, some crazy relatives, and a football-shaped head. The other characters included best friend Gerald Johansson, who, with Arnold, is very great with handshakes, Helga Pataki, the school bully who constantly picks on Arnold with his crush on him, and a slew of classmates and people in the city. Much like Doug and Rugrats, Hey Arnold captures the feel of the city and a child's eye view of the world, and the 90s were all about cartoons about regular kids. Kablam was a cartoon sketch show. The concept was that it's a cartoon comic living comic book crammed with cartoons. 1997 saw a little bit of competition between Kids WB, Cartoon Network, the Disney Channel, Fox Kids, and ABC's new lineup known as Disney's One Saturday Morning. It also had some shows that were creator-driven and about kids in school. Nickelodeon was still strong. There were a few new expansions outside the US and Germany and Spain and so forth. Nickelodeon also had a Never movie, Good Burger, based on the old ad sketch and starring Kenan and Kel. And of course, there were some new shows. Figured Out was the Nickelodeon version of the famous game show What's My Line, but it was more centered at kids and was hosted by Olympic swimmer Summer Sanders. However, since it was a kids show, it did have a lot, like a secret slime action where an analyst who was usually a Nickelodeon star got slime. The Angry Beavers was a Never Nicktoon that premiered and focused on two beavers named Norbert and Daggett who strike out on their own. A lot of great jokes and the voices of Nick Bakay of Sabrina the Teenage Witch as Norb and Richard Van Horvitz from Power Rangers as Dag. 1998 was a very big year for Nickelodeon. Two brand new studios were built in California, Nicktoons Animation Studio and Nickelodeon on Sunset. Nicktoons Studio was the first major cartoon studio to open in Burbank for quite a while, and Nick on Sunset was the new venue for some live-action Nickelodeon shows outside of Nick Studios, Florida. Nick also expanded their line to a full-hour block known as the Nickelozone. The Wild Thornberries was a Never Nicktoon from Klasky Csupo, and they focused on the Thornberry family. The Fobbers, a nature show host, voiced by Tim Curry. The mother shoots as the teen flowers of pain. The adopted child is crazy and has the voice of Red Hot Chili Peppers and Mother Flea. And of course, Eliza, voiced by Alicia Chavert, a party of 5, could talk to animals. That's also the first Nicktoon to have a full half-hour story instead of just 2 stories in one show. Nickelodeon's biggest hit that year was Cat Dog, a show about a cat and a dog literally connected to each other with their crazy mishaps. The voice of Cat was Jim Cummings, who had done Winnie the Pooh and Darkwing Duck, while Tom Kenny, who would also do SpongeBob's dog's voice. The animation was great, the voices were spectacular, but the main thing about the show was the theme song written by the show's creator, Peter Hannon. However, Nickelodeon's biggest breakthrough that year was their first animated film, The Rugrats Movie, which not only introduced Tommy's new brother Dale to the fold, but also became the first Nickelodeon movie, as well as the first non-Disney animated movie to gross in over $100 million at the box office, and it won the 1999 Kids' Choice Award for Favorite Movie. Speaking of which, 1999 was one of Nickelodeon's biggest years because it was their 20th anniversary and it celebrated with a big party. The gifts include, big shock, another Nicktoon known as SpongeBob SquarePants. SpongeBob was about a sea sponge in his life underwater. Still run today, and it was a huge hit for Nick. As the new millennium came in, Nick started doing things that they had never done before. A teen drama. After looking at shows like Beverly Hills 90210 and Dawson's Creek, Caitlin's Way was Nick's first attempt at trying something different. And speaking of which, their newest Nicktoon at the time, as told by Ginger, was more like 90210 than an actual cartoon. The characters aged and changed their clothes. But Ginger wasn't the only Nicktoon that year. We also had Pelswick, which lasted about 2 seasons. It was about a 13-year-old boy in a wheelchair, and it's basically a handicapped version of Doug. So why do some people like it even though it was a big flop? Well, the animation by John Callahan was also in a wheelchair, plus the writing is very clever and has a Family Guy charm to it. And now you know the drill for Nick in the early 2000s. New Nicktoons, new sitcoms, new dramas, new stars are discovered, and so forth. You have The Fairly Odd Parents, which a lot of you know by now, Invader Zim, which is a cult classic, Drake and Josh, which started the career of Miranda Cosgrove, and Avatar The Last Airbender, which is more like a Japanese anime, but made in Burbank. Then Nick started to lose its touch when iCarly began to air. Nick was too influenced by Disney Channel's hit shows like Hannah Montana, That's So Raven, etc., and started a trend of teen sitcoms. And let's just say that iCarly was the show that killed Nickelodeon's charm. They started making shows that were hits with little kids, but not those hardcore Nick fans. Really wanted a place where 90s Nick fans could enjoy seeing all of Nick's shows from the 90s that were canceled. But since Viacom deleted the majority of Nick's videos on YouTube, you couldn't see them on the internet either. And Nickelodeon magazine was out of publication, Nickelodeon Studios was closed down, and even their logo changed. However, in the summer of 2011, Teen Nick, a channel devoted to teenager shows, decided to give the fans what they wanted, a block dedicated to 90s Nickelodeon. The result was the 90s are all that. It was a gigantic hit, and it was only the beginning, seeing how Nickelodeon's greatest hits were on DVD, available on iTunes, and images of the Nickelodeon characters as you loved kid returned to pop culture. So now it leads us to today, Nickelodeon's 35th year, and it begs the question, what does the future hold for the first kids network? Well, more new shows, Nicktoon reunions, books, and so forth. If you're a kid at heart, or just want to be a kid again, watch the classic shows of Nickelodeon in honor of its 35th anniversary.